So I'll just start with the talk itself. First of all, hey, I'm Ishan. I hope you're doing great. I'll be talking about web animations. Basically, what we'll be doing is like we'll be taking a journey on how web animations came into the picture, how it started back in 1957, and how everything just came together. Before that, let's start with the introduction. And this is the part where I was supposed to add a cool intro, but I was lazy enough to not write something. Oh, first of all, it looked way different in the picture and in real life. That's Photoshop. But yeah, I'm a final year undergraduate. I'm currently pursuing my computer science, and I'm working as an intern at HackRank. I build cool stuff on the internet. That is what I like to do. And I've been working with the web for around 8 years now. I started back when I was in eighth or seventh grade, something like that. And in the part time, I also like some UI/UX design. And but before jumping to the actual topic, let's just try to understand why animations or micro interactions are even important in the first place. So when I did a simple Google search, this is what came up. This is literally the first result that I'm reading from. Micro interactions are events which have one main task, a single purpose, and they are found all over your devices and within all the applications that we build, right? Now, how do we define this single purpose? When I was searching for that, I came across this Medium article by Vamsi, and he mentioned he puts this in this way. Uh, their purpose is to delight the user, to create a moment that is engaging enough, welcoming, and dare we say it, and the most important aspect, human. So that is what we'll be talking about today. But I am not sure how many of you still remember seeing this in dial-up internet connection dialogue back in those days. Those Windows XP, Windows 98, those days I remember. Uh, but the thing is, like earlier on, browsers weren't really designed for animations other than scrolling. They were designed to be document viewers. And GIFs were actually introduced back in 1987. That was the first form of animation that we had on the web. Earlier on, it was mostly used by companies to animate or more like rotate their logos. We have ever seen those text-based screensavers in Windows XP or Windows 7? Those were the GIFs that we had at that point. And later on, back when browsers were still at war, there weren't many cross-platform standards to point to. The web was young and rifle. It's kind of like the Big Bang Theory. Developers wanted to be able to create interactive experiences, websites, and games, whatever the cost may be. And that is when Flash came into the picture in 1996. Now, I'm not sure, but if you're someone who is from early 2000s, you may remember websites like miniclip.com. I used to play a lot of games over here. These were all Flash based. And meanwhile, while Flash was a great technology, it went against one core fundamental principle of the web, which is to be open and accessible. And to cut a long story short, Flash support has been deprecated on all major browsers since then. And Adobe did put out a patch to it in 2020. So rest in peace. And last night I was just wandering through the Wayback Machine, archive.org or that slash web. It's a cool thing. And I was just wandering around and I was looking at a couple of websites, like these big websites. And this is how most of the web pages used to look back then. Look at Amazon. And even this is how Apple's web page used to look back in those days. But then things went on, and this was the first language that we had kind of for design. Like earlier on, it was just HTML, as I mentioned, document viewers, and then SMIL was introduced, which is an acronym for Synchronized Multimedia Integration Language. This was introduced way back in 1999, and it was mostly used to animate SVGs, and was created by the Standards Committee. And then for the next few years, things remained pretty stagnant until 2009. There was this twinkling in Steve Jobs' eye and the Safari team, which was building the mobile browser, the Safari version. And they were like, duh, we need to make the web look cool. And we can't use Flash because the chip had some memory constraints. So they came up with some specs for CSS animations and transitions and just threw them out. Since there was no standards process, there was no standards committee. This is why there are not a lot of similarities between Sim, which was introduced back in 1999, and this one. But anyways, in the meantime, what was happening? The folks in the Internet Explorer team, they were now trying to cope up with these three different standards: SIML, then CSS animations, and CSS transitions. And this was very difficult. Like as a web browser, as a company, you have to maintain three different standards, and there is no similarity between any of these. So what they came up with was they came up with something called Web Animations API, and this basically comprised of SMIL, CSS animations, and transitions. At that point, everything under one single umbrella. Now, the animation API is based on two key things. One is timing, and the second thing is animation. Basically, the when and the what. For example, let's say you have this image of a boat. It's a PNG, and you want to just add a fade-in animation. So you'll define the state. Let's say at 0 seconds, it should look something like this. Should have an opacity of 0.2 or 20%. And at 8 seconds, like after 8 seconds, this should be the end results. Now our browsers are smart enough that like they only need the start and end state, and they're smart enough to generate all these frames in between. Now these two frames that we defined in the beginning and at the end, these are called as keyframes because that is where you're defining the state. Now I can't wait to jump into the editor and just show you some cool stuff. So let me pull my editor over here. This is this is something that I created yesterday. So what I'll do is like, so this is a cat. This is CSS only. I'll try to. Okay, bye Bixby. I'll try to ensure that maybe this cat can blink its eyelids. Let's try that. So first of all, what we need to do is we need to define keyframes, and then you give an animation name. And then now since this is state based, let's I'll define that at 0%, the height should be 0 pixels. Over here, basically, I'll be targeting the eyelids. So at 50%, which is the middle state, the height should be, let's say, 100%. And at 100%, which is the end of the animation, it should restore back to 0 pixels. Now we have defined these particular set of keyframes or this animation, but we need to hook this up. So I have this eyelid over here, right over here, apparently. I'll just use the animation property. I'll define first of all, I need to pass the animation name, which is blink. Then you need to pass a duration. Let's say I want this entire animation to occur between 2 seconds, and then like it's then next of the rest of the parameters are not required. But for example, like you just saw that this animation happened once only. I want this cat to blink infinitely, so I'll just add infinite, which is the number of iterations that I want for this particular animation. And that's it, we have a cat which can blink its eyes now. Now coming back to the presentation, so what we just wrote right now, right, these were CSS animations since we are practically writing CSS only. But if you notice one thing closely, over here as well, we had defined a start and an end state, and then everything in between, which was like 0%, 50%, and 100%. Now, because of this reason, these are also called state animations. But like sometimes, like let's say, what if we want to make our cat interactive? Like when when I click on the particular when I click on this cat, I want this cat to blink its eyes. Can you think of something like how can we do that? You can write it in chat maybe. Now, like since YouTube chat takes 30 seconds, so I'll just skip this part. Now, the hint is that when it's told you, I want to animate this cat on a mouse hover or click event. The first intuition that comes to mind is JavaScript because events means event listeners, right? But the animation that we wrote, that was in CSS. So do you mean like, can we do something like CSS plus JS animations? Is it even possible? Hell yes, that is the web animations API for you. Let's just see how it works under the hood. So I'll take the same example. I just have it open in another thing, and I've removed all the CSS part that we just wrote here. It's the same. We are in the same state now. So what I have is like I basically have defined these two particular selectors over here. One is for selecting the face, and the second one is for eyelids. Now let's try to animate this. First of all, I need keyframes. Again, what we wrote over there. So this will be an array, and I want the height to be 0% in the beginning, and then I want the height to become, let's say, 100%, and then last but not the least, height should return back to 0. So now we have defined the keyframes, basically the set of animations, the sequence in which they should occur. Now we need to attach this to the particular eyelids, right? For now, let's just to test this out, let's first try this with one eye. So you can see like this eyelids has document.query selector all. So this will give me an array of both the eyelids, left and the right one. So let's try animating the first one. So I'll just call the animate API, and then I'll pass the keyframes, And now this expects a couple of options, this object of options. Over here as well, I'll define the duration as, let's say, 2000, and it should animate. Yep, it did. Now our cat is winking. So what if I want to do this with both of the eyelids? So like in that case, basically what we can do is eyelids dot for each eyelid, uh, eyelid dot animate. And then we'll pass the same keyframes and duration as again 2000. Now this should work. Yeah, I did, thankfully. Now, what we wanted to do was, like, coming back to the presentation, we wanted to make it stateless. Like, we wanted to make it interactive. When I click on the eye, when I click on the cat's face, then it should animate. Right now, that's not happening even when I'm clicking. So, what we can do is we can use our own JavaScript. We can add an event listener. Face.add event listener, and we can listen to the click event, and then it accepts a callback, of course. In that same callback, we can just pass this particular method that we came up with. Now things should work. Yeah, this is one of the first talks in which my demos went as smoothly as I had imagined. But this is a transcript of what we just wrote right now in that code point, right? What we are basically doing over here is like we're calling this animate API for each of these elements, and this accepts two parameters, just keyframes and options. Now, under the hood, what this API is actually doing, it's calling this animation constructor, new animation, and this just passing down the keyframes and various other options we just discussed. Now, this is where things get interesting because with CSS animations, we just mentioned that those are state animations, right? You have a start and an end. You can't really listen to events. But with this animation constructor, what we can do is we can leverage this to play with different animation states. You can pause, play, reverse, finish, cancel an animation at any particular instance of time. And this, in fact, this is a quote from the Web Animations API spec itself. This is an excerpt. It says, time may be shifted backwards and forwards, scaled, reversed, paused, and repeated. And that is exactly what we are doing. We were doing, right? I know. You might be like, hey, like it's cool, but what's the big deal? It's just an API, right? Let me try to answer that by this. Now, how many of you are Marvel fans over here? You can raise your hands in the chat. Well, I am one, and recently I was watching this show Moon Knight, and then one of my designer friends reached out to me, and she asked me, "Hey, bro, do you think it would be possible to build something like this in the web?" Like this was a particular scene in which he's turning the sky, and as a CSS guy and a web person, like I was like, yeah, sure, anything is possible with web. Although I wasn't too sure how to do it, and that's when Web Animations API came to the rescue. Now let me show you. Let me show you like what I made then. So again, I'm just using a Web Animations API over here. I have a couple of PNGs. Once you click on it, sky turns, and you get a fancy code. Let me show you another web page which I truly love. Like this was Apple's Mac OS page for the Big Sur update. Right now it doesn't exist, so I had to go to the Wayback Machine and then I figured this out. But the moment I saw this, right, for the first time, now just imagine this. For now, it just looks pretty simple. But once you start scrolling, this thing happens. The first time I saw it, it was like magical for me. Like, how is this happening? Like, I was as a web developer, like I have never seen this in the last 8 years when I was working with it, and I was just too amazed by it. And that day, I started searching how can we build something like this. Like, I still remember I was like, whoa, how did they do it? How can we create something like this? So it's actually pretty simple. Like even like I saw I mentioned GSAP, you can do this with GSAP as well. But first, let's try to break this down. So what we just saw was that you have a MacBook, let's say, and you have a window which is coming from the top left corner, which is basically a PNG, a transparent PNG, and then another one from the bottom right, and then a notification panels which is coming from the top right corner, and lastly another iMessage window which pops in from the bottom left. Now these are all individual animations, but when you put all of these together, it produces this immersive effect or this illusion. And what those folks at Apple were doing was that they were just playing a sequence of animations at the same time. Of course, we can achieve this with the Web Animations API as well, which we just discussed about. But things might start looking messier in code as we progress. Just imagine like you have to maintain the state at like at every single time. Like let's say the first thing which is coming in, the first image which is coming in, if this is exactly at zero point 0.3 seconds, then you should run the next sequence of animation, and so on. So just maintaining the state itself and synchronizing all of these animations together might become a bit overwhelming. So what we need is a conductor, not the physics one which can like conduct electrons, but a person who leads an orchestra, because you're just playing an orchestra of different animations, right? And this is where libraries like GSAP or Motion One, this is like Motion.dev, I recently came across it, and even Freeman Motion, like Saurabh discussed, can come into the picture. So one thing that like these are a bit different from each other in various other aspects, but one thing that both of these libraries have in common is this timeline constructor. This timeline constructor accepts an array or a sequence of animations. And this is where I told you, like the animation API that we just saw, that animation constructor, that is pretty interesting. Because what that animation constructor does is like it accepts two different props. One is effect and one is timeline. These effects were the keyframe effects that we just passed on. And then timeline. By default, our browsers have something called document.timeline. This is the main timeline which on top of which all our CSS animations run. Like when we create that cat animation, what was actually happening was if I create a new tab, like if I just open console, let me just clear the console once. It if you try to see documented timeline, will give you the exact time in milliseconds that you have spent on this particular page. And our CSS animations basically hook up into this particular timeline, and that's how they get executed. So when earlier on when we were calling that animate API, that was actually using this particular document or timeline in order to run our animations. Now what but like these are all so far we have been just looking into plain animations, right? How do we synchronize them with scroll bar? Again, if you were paying attention in Saurav's talk, he also mentioned this particular plugin, scroll trigger. So GSAP has this particular plugin, scroll trigger. What that does is basically it replaces a timeline object in the animation and helps in controlling the sequence in which they appear. So instead of using the default document or timeline, we use the scroll trigger timeline, and which maintains like, okay, if the scroll bar is at this particular position, then the animation should be at this particular instance of time. Now it's again calling all those if pause, play, reverse, that those things under the hood. And now sometimes in your products, you might want to go for rather a plug and play option, right? Instead of writing everything from scratch using GSAP and all these heavy libraries. And to be honest, like sometimes GIF works, but it might not be the best choice because of first of all high file size. They are low resolution, they are not scalable. These are not vector based, and quality and a lot of other limitations as well. So that's where Lottie files come into the picture. These are pure SVG based animations, which means first of all they are scalable since they are vector based, and they don't take up a lot of size because you don't have a sequence of like, so what basically gives are gifts are basically you have a sequence of images which are called frames, and you have like, let's say if you have more than 24 images per second, that gives you the solution that it's a video. But Lorify works in a very different way. That's why these are very lightweight. Now, let's to wrap up. Like we started back with GIFs from 1987, then Flash, then SIML, then CSS animations and transitions, and then we looked at the web animations API, then libraries like GSAP and Motion, Lottie files, and although there's so much more to cover, but let's just take a moment to appreciate how far we have come, right? Like maybe let's take a look at where we are headed as well. Back in 1987, when we had nothing, when we still had those dial-up connection screens with no animations at all, to this like and all the cool examples that Saurabh showcased with 3D effects, 3JS, and everything. Now, what are some of the new things that we are cooking up with the animations world? Let's try to take a quick look into that as well. So last year, Chrome developers they announced this experimental API which they were working with. It's called the Page Transitions API, and as the name suggests, it's used for transitioning or navigating between different pages. So it can be enabled. Actually, right now, if you are running on Chrome, your browsers may already support this. It can be enabled behind this hidden flag. If you go to Chrome/flag/document transition, you can enable it and you can experiment around with it. But once this gets rolled out, adding transitions between different pages would be as easier as adding this one single code snippet in your navigator or history.push if you're someone who comes from React background. And like even right now, without the page transitions API as well, you can do this. You can use things like frame and motion, which helps you to ease down this entire thing. But still, the APIs are not very easier to work with, like what we have right now. So page transitions API is something that Chrome developers are experimenting with. Now, there is something which we didn't talk about today because of constraints of time, but there are a lot more things which are possible with web animations, and we haven't even touched 3JS and WebGL. Or you can think of these as 3D animations. Like you can even have custom shaders which do all the cool stuff that Ashara was showcasing in awards websites as well. Now, here is one of my favorite examples. I just came across it a couple of days ago, and I really wanted to share it. So, this is one website I came across, and if you scroll down, you'll see this one thing. Though this is all 3D, you have a bunch of album art covers, a series, and I right now I'm not sharing audio because if I did, like there will be a copyright strike on this channel as well. But if you click on this particular thumbnail, you'll hear the music as well, and that's just something incredibly cool. The first time I saw it, I was again that same Apple Mac OS page effect. Like, how did they do this? So these are things you can also do with 3GS and WebGL. Perhaps we can talk about some other day. Also, one another important thing which we didn't cover today, and something we should account for whenever we are crafting any animations for the web, is accessibility. You should ensure that for all your potential users, including people with disabilities, they always have a decent user experience and are able to easily access your information. Like animations are cool when they are subtle, but you should not overdo it to some extent. But again, since we are short on time, maybe we can just take this up on some other day. Before I end, though, I would like to give a huge shout out to Akansha. She's a maintainer at Excalibur, and she's one of my mentors, and she's the one who encouraged me to even submit a proposal for this talk in the first place. And with that, we have reached the end. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you like the talk. And in case you have any feedback or just want to hang out and have a fun chat, feel free to connect with me on these handles. Yeah, that's it. Back